Raindrops began to patter softly against the broad, arched windows of the library, casting the outside world into a misty haze of shifting shadows and silvery streaks. Inside, the cool, fresh scent brought in by the storm mingled with the musty aroma of aging books. Towering shelves filled with time-worn volumes stood like silent sentinels, their cracked spines bearing witness to countless stories tucked away over the years. For many, the library was a haven, a quiet retreat where they could find solace among forgotten tales, just like Emma. Emma Walker, a 17-year-old who preferred solitude to the noise of high school life, sat at her usual desk in the far corner of the library, partially concealed beneath the overhang of a tall bookshelf. Here, she could disappear into her own world, leaving the bustling, dramatic high school scene behind. While her peers buzzed with talk of weekend plans, sports, and relationships, Emma found comfort in her books, especially her astronomy texts that promised glimpses of distant stars and planets. But today, Emma was not alone. Across from her, a new student sat at the other end of the reading table. Callow, as he'd introduced himself on his first day, had arrived only a couple of months earlier. There was an aura of mystery about him, a certain detachment that made him stand out from the usual crowd. His sharp features, fair complexion, and hair that seemed to capture light in strange ways gave him a haunting, almost otherworldly look, as though he belonged in a gothic story rather than the everyday reality of their school. His dark eyes, with an almost ethereal hint of blue, seldom met anyone's gaze directly. Rumors had quickly taken root, flitting through the hallways like whispers in the wind. Emma had heard snatches of gossip. "He's so strange, barely speaks to anyone. I bet he's trouble, probably got kicked out of his last school," but she dismissed such talk. Being the target of whispers herself had taught her not to judge others by idle rumors. As the rain outside intensified, Emma's attention drifted from her book, and she stole a glance at Callow. He was bent over a notebook, writing with a focused intensity, his mechanical pencil darting across the page in quick, precise strokes. From where she sat, she could just make out a mix of complex symbols, diagrams, and what looked like star charts filling the pages. She had seen that notebook before. He was rarely without it, spending lunch hours and breaks absorbed in its contents, closing it swiftly whenever anyone drew too close. This stormy afternoon, Callow seemed even more absorbed than usual, almost oblivious to his surroundings. For a fleeting moment, Emma's curiosity stirred, wondering what might be so absorbing as to make him withdraw so completely. She shook off the thought and returned to her book, determined to stay in her own world. Time slipped by, and Emma was fully immersed in her reading, the library fading into the background. But the silence was suddenly interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps, echoing sharply through the quiet space. Callow's eyes narrowed slightly as he regarded her, as if calculating whether she was someone he could trust, or someone he had to protect his secrets from. The silence between them thickened, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain outside and the faint whisper of pages rustling as he clutched the notebook against his chest. His gaze softened for a moment, the sharpness giving way to something that almost seemed like vulnerability. After what felt like an eternity, Callow spoke, his voice just above a whisper. "It's not a language from around here," he said, choosing his words with a care that only heightened Emma's curiosity. He glanced at the door, then back to her, his jaw clenching as he considered his next words. "The symbols, they're not from any human system." Emma's eyes widened, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "You're saying, you mean they're from—" Her voice trailed off, too afraid to even complete the thought. Callow nodded, his expression as unreadable as ever. "From somewhere far beyond what you know." She looked at him, her mind whirling with questions. It sounded absurd, yet the pulsing light she had seen on the notebook's pages felt too real to dismiss. Gathering her courage, she asked, "Is that why you're here? Are you from somewhere else?" A flicker of hesitation crossed his face, but he didn't turn away. "Not exactly," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of an unspoken history. "But I'm connected to it. Let's just say I don't entirely belong here." Emma took a steadying breath. Despite the strangeness of it all, Callow's tone was sincere, not some fantasy spun by a rebellious teen. "So the notebook, it has information about where you're from? It has things I need to remember, things I need to protect," he replied, casting a protective glance at the notebook. "Things that, if anyone else saw, could put both of us in danger." Emma felt a chill ripple through her as she took in the gravity of his words. "You mean me too?" His eyes met hers, filled with a warning, but also a strange kind of understanding. "Now that you've seen it, yes. The less you know, the safer you'll be." She stood there, torn between fear and an inexplicable pull to understand more. "I didn't mean to intrude, Callow," she said quietly, "but if there's any way I can help." A faint, reluctant smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "If you're gonna keep asking questions, then maybe you'll have to know a little." But but just a little. He glanced around the library, as if making sure no one else was within earshot. And not here. We need somewhere quieter. Emma nodded, excitement sparking through her anxiety. Whatever secrets Callow carried, they were dangerous, yes, but they were also a part of something far beyond her ordinary world. And for once, she felt the thrill of stepping outside the invisible walls that had held her in place for so long. As they slipped out of the library together, Emma couldn't help but feel that her life was about to change in ways she'd never imagined. Emma took a steadying breath, trying to ground herself amid the overwhelming flood of thoughts. So, what happens now? Her voice trembled, barely above a whisper. Callow looked away for a moment, as if grappling with an answer that was both painful and inevitable. Now, you're part of this, whether you want to be or not. His voice held a quiet resignation, the weight of an obligation he didn't seem entirely comfortable with. There are others who would do anything to keep our existence a secret. And if they knew you'd seen this, he let the sentence hang, his meaning all too clear. Emma's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. Then teach me, she said, surprising herself with the resolve in her voice. If I'm already in danger, I should at least understand what's going on. Callow's expression shifted, a mixture of surprise and admiration in his gaze. Emma, this isn't a story you can just step into and out of. My people, they're careful, cautious. They won't hesitate to protect what they've hidden. She squared her shoulders, meeting his intense gaze head-on. I'm not afraid, she said, even as a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that she was, in fact, terrified. But there was something about this strange new world that had opened before her, something that felt real and right in a way she couldn't explain. Besides, she added, you said you needed my help. Maybe this is what I was meant to find. For a long moment, Callow simply looked at her, as if trying to decide whether he could trust her with the weight of his secrets. Finally, he nodded, a reluctant acceptance in his eyes. All right, he murmured, but once you start down this path, there's no turning back. Emma nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration. I'm ready. The air between them seemed to shift, as if the storm outside had settled into a quiet truce. Callow drew a breath, letting the weight of his decision settle over him. Then meet me here tomorrow after everyone's gone. I'll show you what I can. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the library, leaving Emma standing alone with her thoughts, and a life that would never be the same again. Emma took a shaky breath, her gaze locked onto Callow's face, absorbing the vulnerability beneath his hardened exterior. It was as though a mask had slipped, revealing someone desperate yet resigned, someone who had lived a life far beyond the halls of a high school. She could feel the pulse of his fear, his anger, his regret, emotions that felt heavy and foreign, yet strangely familiar in their intensity. What do we do now? She asked, barely recognizing her own voice, small and uncertain in the vast quiet of the library. Callow looked away, his gaze settling on the rain-streaked windows, a faint glimmer of sorrow in his eyes. We run, he said simply, at least for now. We can't stay here. It's only a matter of time before they catch up to me. To us, the weight of that reality hit her like a blow. Just minutes ago, she'd been an ordinary girl with ordinary worries, grades, classes, figuring out the maze of high school life. And now she was tangled in something unimaginable, her life at risk because of secrets she hadn't asked to know. Yet somehow, a strange determination rose in her chest. If we run, she began slowly, meeting his gaze, where would we go? How far can we even get? Callow's eyes softened, his earlier bitterness replaced by a hint of admiration. I don't know, he admitted, his voice carrying an unexpected gentleness. But I have a few places in mind. I've learned how to survive by staying hidden. You'd be surprised how far we can go without being noticed. Emma swallowed, feeling the enormity of his words settling like stones in her stomach. But at the same time, something inside her, a piece of herself she'd never known, was stirred awake. She'd never been the type to step into unknown territory, but now there was no choice. Her fear was tempered by a spark of something new, resolve. All right, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll go with you, but I need to know more. I need to understand exactly what I'm up against. Callow nodded, his expression a mix of relief and something that might have been pride. You'll know everything you need to, I promise, he said. But for now, we have to leave before it's too late. He extended a hand toward her, a silent offer, a promise. She looked at it for a moment, her mind racing with everything she was about to leave behind. Then, with a deep breath, she took his hand, feeling his grip warm warm and solid, grounding her amid the swirling chaos. Together, they moved through the dim library, past the shelves that had once been her sanctuary, and into a world that was rapidly becoming anything but safe. The life Emma had known was slipping away, piece by piece, and with it, any semblance of the ordinary. But as they stepped into the rain-drenched night, she felt a strange exhilaration, a pull toward the unknown. And with Callow by her side, she realized she wasn't quite as afraid of it as she had been before. Emma held his gaze for a moment, her heart heavy with an ache she couldn't quite name. Callow's words lingered in the air, raw and unguarded, a glimpse into a life that had been shadowed by fear and loss for far too long. She turned her eyes back to the rain-soaked streets, the familiar outlines of her town slipping into the mist, becoming memories with each mile they traveled. They drove in silence, the rhythmic hum of the engine blending with the drumming rain. The world outside the car seemed to fade away, replaced by a growing sense of isolation and uncertainty. As they left the last stretch of town behind, Emma took a deep breath, the finality of her choice settling into her bones. There would be no going back. "Is it always like this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Running, hiding, watching every corner?" Callow's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale in the dim light. "It's all I've ever known," he admitted, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Ever since I left home, I haven't stopped looking over my shoulder, haven't stopped feeling like I'm being watched." Emma watched him closely, seeing the weight he carried, the years of isolation, of endless vigilance. "It must be exhausting," she murmured, unable to imagine the toll such a life must have taken. A humorless smile flickered across his lips. "You get used to it. Eventually, the fear just becomes normal. It's the only way to survive." She felt a pang of sympathy, realizing that the guarded, distant boy she'd seen at school was just a fragment of someone who had been shaped by unimaginable hardships. "I can't believe you've managed to keep all of this to yourself," she said softly. "All that time, no one ever knew." Callow's gaze shifted to her, a faint warmth breaking through his usual coolness. "Until now," he replied. "I didn't think I'd ever tell anyone, but then, I never expected to meet someone like you." His words caught her off guard, and she felt her cheeks flush. She looked away, unsure of how to respond. But deep down, she felt something shift, a quiet sense of purpose stirring within her. Whatever happened next, she was a part of this now, a part of Callow's world, for better or worse. They drove on, the rain thickening as they left the town far behind. Fields and darkened forests stretched out on either side of the road, an endless expanse that seemed to swallow them whole. Emma's pulse quickened as they neared a narrow, overgrown road that branched off from the main route, barely visible through the sheets of rain. "This is it," Callow murmured, turning onto the hidden path. The car lurched forward, bouncing over the uneven ground as they ventured deeper into the woods. Towering trees loomed on either side, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to press in from all directions. After what felt like hours, they reached a small clearing where a rundown cabin stood, half concealed by the trees. Callow killed the engine and turned to her, his gaze solemn. "We should be safe here, at least for a while." Emma nodded, glancing at the cabin with a mix of apprehension and relief. As they climbed out of the car, the rain continued to fall, soaking them as they hurried toward the cabin's creaking door. Callow fumbled for a key, unlocking it with a quick twist of his wrist. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A few worn chairs, a small cot, and a scattering of blankets. It was clear that it hadn't been used in a long time. Callow set his backpack down on the floor, looking around as if he were seeing it for the first time. Emma hugged her arms around herself, trying to ward off the cold. "So, what now?" Callow met her gaze, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Now, we prepare," he said quietly, "because this won't be the last time we'll have to run. And when they find us," his voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. "When they came, there would be no mercy." Emma shivered, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a chill. But as she looked at him, standing there with his fierce determination and quiet strength, she felt a strange sense of resolve. She was in this now, there was no turning back. With a shaky breath, she stepped forward, determination hardening her gaze. "Then let's make sure we're ready for them." Emma watched the road disappear into the rain-drenched night, each mile taking her farther from the life she'd known. A surge of emotion welled up inside her, fear, excitement, and strangely, a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. Despite the danger, despite the impossible stakes, she felt as though she'd finally found her place, standing beside someone who understood her in a way no one else had. She looked over at Callow, taking in his steady, determined expression. His world was built on secrets and survival, and yet here he was, trusting her with something that could change the fate of his entire people. She wondered what had made him take that risk, what he saw in her that she couldn't see in herself. Callow's voice broke the silence. "I didn't want this for you," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "You deserve a life free of this burden. But now that you're here," he glanced at her, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his face. "I'm grateful." Emma felt her cheeks warm, though she wasn't sure if it was from the compliment or the sheer intensity of his words. "I don't know how much help I can be," she admitted. "I mean, I've never been in a fight, never been part of a rebellion. I barely know anything about your world." He gave her a reassuring smile. "You're braver than you think, Emma, and sometimes it's the people who aren't hardened by the fight who bring the most strength. You remind me of what we're fighting for, a life where people don't have to live in fear." They fell into a comfortable silence, the rain softening as they neared the edge of town. Emma felt the weight of her decision settle more firmly in her chest, but she was no longer afraid. Instead, a sense of purpose steadied her, pushing away the doubt. If she could help Callow, if she could be part of something bigger than herself, she was willing to risk everything. As they approached the hidden turn that would lead them to the safe house, Emma braced herself, letting go of the last threads of her old life. The road ahead was unknown, full of dangers she could barely imagine, but for the first time, she felt ready. With Callow by her side, she was prepared to face whatever lay beyond the storm.